So this last point, how you define success. Yeah. So I'm just going to repeat something I said, kind of touched on a minute earlier. I remember my daughter talking to me about who was successful and who wasn't, and how we value success. And I think I mentioned 8th grade art teacher was somebody who did that for his whole life, a success or not. And there actually was such a man, and there probably is more than one such a person. Lots of people, lots of teachers in particular, by the way, who particularly elementary school teachers, junior high school teachers, who do not make big salaries, who do not run big companies, but work very, very hard to teach and help young people get on the right track. And so my daughter was always interested in art, and in her middle school in Manhattan, there was a beloved art teacher. Of course, I don't remember his name. And he had spent like a 45-year career as an beloved art teacher at this middle school. And he retired and got lots of kudos and blessings and everything else. And I remember when my daughter was, talking about, living in Manhattan, the Upper West Side, even if we go to the public schools, which my daughter did through her schooling, you come up against people who have lots of money, big careers and impressive titles and everything else, and they're flying here and they're flying there, and they have a home here and they have a home there. And those are all fine. That's all good stuff. But that is not, in my view, what everything in life is for. So I just remember when my daughter was talking about, people like that, I just remember asking her, well, what about Mr. So-and-so, your art teacher? Spent his whole career teaching in a middle school. He seems to have had an influence on a lot of people's lives. Is he successful? Is he a success? So think about that. Now, the last thing I'm going to do here, or the second to the last thing I'm going to do, is to show you 3.5 minutes of a film I happen to love. It's called It's a Wonderful Life. It's usually broadcast before Christmas. It's a Christmas film, and Christmas is, I guess, supposedly, well, it is. I'm not going to get into religion. I'm just going to say it's a holiday film. Let's just say that. Christmas holiday film. And the man you're seeing here on the left is James Stewart, who was a very successful Hollywood actor, studio actor in the 1930s and early 40s. And I think even won an Oscar for The Philadelphia Story with Katharine Hepburn in the 30s. He was tall. He was like a Princeton graduate who went to Hollywood and had a very successful career. He's a very, very talented, interesting actor. Always kind of plays the same character in a way, but as a naturalistic, very good actor. Now, he, in World War II, enlisted, and unlike a lot of actors, he actually saw a lot of combat experience in World War II. He went to England. He was a bomber pilot. He had 15 months of active bombing combat duty, piloting a bomber that flew from Britain over Germany and Europe, dropping bombs. And a lot of the survival rate for those guys in those planes is not very high. very difficult. And he was in the armed forces, I think, for 4 or 5 years. And after the war, he actually, wasn't sure what he wanted to do. He definitely had PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome. And I just read about it recently. He went back and actually lived with his parents for a while in the Midwest. I want to say Indiana. I'm not sure if that's right. But eventually thought, well, I've got to face Hollywood. Am I going to be able to go back and do this acting thing? What does that all mean? I've just been in World War II in combat for 15 months. I mean, who cares about acting in little movies? But this Hollywood director, Frank Capra, who was really brilliant, did some amazing films in the 1930s that I suggest you guys look at, starting with It Happened One Night, which maybe is the original rom-com and maybe the best rom-com ever made, even though it's in black and white. And he did Mr. Smith Goes to Washington with Jimmy Stewart. He did, I want to say Mr. Deeds Goes to Town. Is that what it's called? I think that's right. Anyway, he did some very thoughtful, interesting films. Lost Horizon he did based on a book of that name. Anyway, Frank Capra wanted to make this film, It's a Wonderful Life. And it was based on a book. And he wanted Jimmy Stewart for the part of sort of the all-American, middle-of-the-road man in a small town, not a teeny town, but in a small town, and what he made of his life. And I hope you guys have seen this film. I didn't see it till I was, I think in my 30s or so. I never saw it growing up, but it's a wonderful film. It's a Wonderful Life. And very quickly in the plot of the movie, Jimmy Stewart always wants to go leave his town of Bedford Falls and go off and explore and have this wonderful, glamorous, adventurous life. But he always gets pulled back. He's the guy who kind of takes the responsibility, who picks up the load that everyone else drops. And but he does marry the woman he's in love with, and they have a family. And yet, at his business, he faces a kind of a catastrophe. Here's a spam call coming in, everybody. Remember the telemarketing lecture? Yeah. Hang on. By the way, it says spam on my screen with a question mark. That's my landline. Anyway, the books don't balance at the Bailey Brothers Building and Loan, and Jimmy Stewart may go to prison because the bank's getting audited. And so he feels his life is just a horrible failure and everything else, and he tries to commit suicide, and he's rescued. And he's shown what the world in Bedford Falls would be like if he had never been born, because he basically says, I wish I'd never been born. And then he sees the difference that he made in lots of people's lives. And it's a wonderful movie. And this is the end video. So here's Jimmy Stewart. It was filmed in 1946, the year after World War II ended. It came out in 1947. Jimmy Stewart wasn't sure he wanted to even act. He had a dialogue with the guy who played the evil one, Lionel Barrymore. It's a whole other story. In his wheelchair, Mr. Potter. Jimmy Stewart said, what am I doing this for? And I think Lionel Barrymore said something like, well, you spent a number of years bombing people. I mean, wouldn't you just like to entertain them? And so there's a message here in this ending, and it's the message that you see demonstrated by all the people in the film. This is the very end of the film. And it's a message that you see written on the inside cover of a very famous American novel. And I believe that this is, in fact, the real key to success. And so I have now stepped into giving personal life advice. So just watch this, please. It's only 3.5 minutes. If you've seen it before, It won't kill you to watch it again.